Well, hello and welcome back to the Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we chronicle transcendent truth by traveling further up and further into the classic works of children's literature. This is Season 9, Episode 1, The Grandmother, which covers chapters 1 through 3 of The Princess and the Goblin.
New book, who dis?
we were preparing for this all summer long as we were getting ready. We're going to skip over that because there might be some people listening for the first time, and that is not a great intro.
I want them to know what they're getting into.
That is true. So
here's what you're getting into.
What
you have over 105 episodes to catch up on if you want to understand all the references and cameos that are going to happen this season.
To see who's going to show up.
Yeah. It's like the Marvel Cinematic Universe in here.
Yes, you're going to be just throwing left and right. You don't know who's going to show up.
No, I want to clarify that you do not need to go back and start with the beginning of these episodes. You can start right here. And
That's
we
true.
wanted to introduce ourselves so that you can start with this season if you wanted to. And you can start with Season 9, Episode 1 and just understand what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Sure. Why don't you actually, I wasn't planning on doing this right now, but here we are. It's already happened. Why don't you tell listeners, because some people might be new, some people might be listening for the first time in a while. We had a little shorter season between the last battle and now The Princess and the Goblin. This is kind of a little bit of a soft reboot of the show, if you will, because we started this show as a Chronicles of Narnia podcast, and then Lewis only wrote 7 of them, and we did it.
We ran out of books.
We ran out of books to do.
So we are rebranding. Instead of the Lamppost Listener, we're just Lamppost Listener.
Oh, goodness.
That's a joke about the Suicide Squad movies.
I understood it. I got it.
Just telling the new people.
The reboot's going to be a lot better of a show, but no one's going to show up to watch it.
Right. We're available on Max. At the bottom.
So, Phil, what was the show for the last 7 years or so, and what is the show now?
Starting in 2018, we recorded episodes about each chapter of the Chronicles of Narnia. Mm-hmm. And we started out as novices, and we didn't quite become experts, but we learned quite a bit in the process. And we really enjoyed Lewis's work. We read some of Lewis's essays most recently in Season 8. Mm-hmm. And that served as a transition into what we're doing next, which is both investigating Lewis's influences. George MacDonald was one of his main influences, but we're also looking at children's literature in a broader sense. So not just Lewis's work, but other types of literature that is aimed at a younger audience.
That's great. That's well said. And if listeners weren't with us in Season 8, where what we called Further Up and Further In, we were reading through some of Lewis's essays, and we finished with On Fairy Stories by Tolkien. At the end of that episode, we gave kind of a short overview of our podcast mission statement, if you will, that we're chronicling transcendent truth as we travel further up and further in to classic works of children's literature, and that we're doing that with Lewis as a Virgil-like guide for us through all of that. And Lewis is going to come up a lot today. So for those, I know we have listeners who've been with us for the last 8 seasons, and maybe you're a little sad that we're no longer reading a book by Lewis, but his name actually appears more in my notes today than George MacDonald does. So he's still very much going to be with us. In fact, maybe it's time for us to transition to some of his words themselves, unless you have anything else you want to mention.
The last thing I want to mention is if you're here because you search for Narnia in the podcast app, those episodes are still available and they'll be up. So you can also listen to those if you're looking for the Chronicles of Narnia ones.
We always tell people Season 1. Phil said we couldn't buy nice microphones until we'd committed doing it for 1 season. And
no, until we did 5 episodes.
5 episodes.
And then we got nice microphones.
No, I think we went the whole first season, right?
No.
Oh.
The deal was we do 5 episodes and they had to be fully finished and then start going out, and then we got really nice equipment.
That shows you how much I've gone back and listened to our stuff, which is not at all.
When they come here to film the documentary about us, let me talk to them.
Well, I'll be honest. I don't know a lot about George MacDonald outside of what Lewis has actually said about him, and then what kind of just comes up in kind of polite nerd conversation. I know that he was born in Scotland. He lived in the 19th century. He had a really large family. He was a pastor, and then was kind of not fired from being a pastor, but I think the elders of his church were so upset with him that they kept paying him less and less until he was forced to resign. And then kind of turned to writing novels. And we know that Lewis says it was MacDonald's work, Fantastes, he says, which baptizes his imagination. Tolkien says a bit about him as well, too. In fact, he talked about him in that essay on fairy stories. But I actually don't know. I mean, I pretty much shared all that I know about George MacDonald. And instead of, starting this season by giving one kind of long history lesson on him, just like we did when we first started reading through Lewis, we're going to use the entire season to uncover more. In fact, we have some interviews planned with some experts who can come on, tell us more about maybe some of his theology, some of his faith, some of his family life, all these other things. But what we want to do here, at the beginning of the season, we don't want to overanalyze things. We always want to synthesize things here on our show. And so we try to focus more on just the story itself. Doesn't mean that we don't care about the context of what's going on. But Lewis actually encouraged us to do this in some of his essays, but to focus on the story and let it speak for itself. And then we'll kind of unpack things along the way. So I'm kind of excited about the fact that I don't know a lot about where the story is coming from. I know it's published in 1872. I don't know a ton of the influences that might have brought into it. I mean, it's just exciting. Do you know a lot about MacDonald?
Oh, I had a little bit of exposure to George MacDonald at an early age. My dad is a big fan, one of the biggest George MacDonald fans. And
he runs the fan club, I believe.
he definitely funds it. He has ordered quite a few George MacDonald books. I think he has read all of them at this point, and he may have read all of them twice. But he finishes the whole group, and then he starts over. He even had out-of-print books printed and shipped to his house.
Yeah, that's awesome.
One-off editions so that he could have all of them. Now he does everything digitally, too. And I grew up listening to him read We Sir Gibbie, which is an adapted version of Sir Gibbie of the Highlands. And it was still difficult to understand and a little bit above my level at the time, but I'm so grateful for it because I remember it having a big influence on being able to understand stuff a little bit on the edge of my understanding. Mm-hmm. And I was pleasantly surprised that The Princess and the Goblin is a little bit easier to read than I was expecting.
Oh, good.
And it also has very bite-sized chapters. I mean, almost James Patterson level page-turning chapters.
That's why we had to do 3 chapters an episode, or else we'd be doing 15-minute episode, right. Which we're not going to take the time to produce a 15-minute episode every 2 weeks. I don't know how much people would really enjoy that.
Yeah, so we'll be covering chapters 1 through 3 today, and then 4 through 6, and then in chunks of 3
throughout the entire season. I think I have it planned out that it should actually work out to be about 3 chapters per episode for those that are reading at home. And I think the last episode is just maybe 2 chapters. But yeah, we'll usually cover about 3 chapters. If people do want to, follow along at home, obviously people could do that with Narnia as well too. But this actually is somewhat both easier and harder to follow along at home. It's easier because the book is in the public domain. It's harder because the book is in the public domain.
Right. And when the book is in public domain, anybody can publish it, and sometimes you don't get a great version.
Which
sometimes your podcasting partner doesn't send you a very nice version, and the print
I have a great version over here.
I walked in the door thinking that he was also going to have this very poor quality edition with the margins they're literally razor thin margins.
It's a really bad printing of the book.
And the cover has this weird feel to it. But then I see Daniel's copy, and Daniel got himself a really nice Puffin Classic version.
To be fair, I really didn't
luxurious
realize
margins.
I bought my copy of the book years ago, and I just went on to Amazon and just clicked the same thing, and I guess it was trying to save me money and just sent the cheapest version to you, which was like $1.99, but it is it's very clear that we paid $1.99 for it. So just be careful out there if you're going to read along with us. Maybe go see if you find one at your local bookstore, or make sure someone like an actual publishing company is publishing it, unless you don't mind reading size 8 font. And in which case, then $1.99 go on the internet.
You'll get your money's worth. My favorite part is also that it was published 8 days ago.
Wow!
They printed this out 8 days ago.
Just when I ordered it, pretty much, I guess.
I think they got your order, printed it out, put it in the mail, and it arrived the next day.
Went along with it. Okay. Well, Phil, let's talk a little bit about the book, though, before we dive in. And mostly what I want to share are things that I actually just came across today, and I don't know what to make of it. And I think this is going to be more of a season-long conversation, but I think it's a great place for us to start. Now, earlier today, I picked up a copy of C.S. Lewis's anthology on George MacDonald. And if listeners don't know, because I think you already have a copy of this, but I have never owned a copy of it before, Lewis published an anthology on MacDonald as a just kind of a collection of his quotes, and it's mostly some of his more of his religious quotes. It was published in 1946, so it was published about 4 years before Narnia came out. And Lewis doesn't have much to say himself, except for there's about a 5 or 6 page preface at the beginning of it. And I wanted to read a little bit from this preface because honestly, it caught me off guard and kind of made me not want to read George MacDonald.
Oh,
because Lewis doesn't have a lot of actually great things to say about him as a writer. I'm just going to read a couple of quotes to you, and I'll let you just take them as you will, Phil. Here you go. Here's one of the things that Lewis says. Necessity made MacDonald a novelist, but few of his novels are good, and none is very good. Lewis also goes on to say this. If we define literature as an art whose medium is words, then certainly MacDonald has no place in its first rank, perhaps not even in its second. There are indeed passages, many of them in this collection, he's speaking about his anthology here, where the wisdom and, I dare to call it, the holiness that are in him triumph over and even burn away the baser elements in his style. The expression becomes precise, weighty, economic, acquires a cutting edge. But he does not maintain this level for long. The texture of his writing as a whole is undistinguished, at times fumbling.
well, we are really in for a treat, aren't we?
So you guys excited for a whole season of George MacDonald?
This a little bit reminds me of the thing we talked about at the end of episode 8, where Tolkien was invited to give a talk on
exactly, yeah.
Andrew
Lang.
And he just basically insults him the whole time.
So Lewis starts this way, and it doesn't sound great. But I did want to share 2 longer quotes, though, because obviously Lewis, if he's taking the time to write this anthology, and we know in Lewis's writing, including Surprised by Joy, that he speaks very highly of MacDonald. But Lewis is saying it's not as much as a writer that he's influenced by him. It's more of MacDonald as a storyteller. And this is the distinction that Lewis wants us to understand, the idea of there being a difference between writer and storyteller. Okay, he then, though, says this very complimentary thing in response to maybe some of these negative things he said. What he, meaning MacDonald, does best is fantasy. And this, in my opinion, he does better than any man. The critical problem with which we are confronted is whether this art, the art of myth-making, is a species of the literary art. The objection to so classifying it is that the myth does not essentially exist in words at all. Okay, follow with me just for a little bit longer, because this is where Lewis is actually going to help us bridge between our very last episode on fairy stories. Lewis says, form and content can there be separated only by a false abstraction. But in a myth, in a story where the mere pattern of events is all that matters, this is not so. Any means of communication, whatever which succeeds in lodging those events in our imagination has, as we say, done the trick. After that, you can throw the means of communication away. To be sure, if the means of communication are words, it is desirable that a letter which brings you important news should be fairly written, but this is only a minor convenience. For the letter will, in any case, go into the waste paper basket as soon as you have mastered its contents, and the words are going to be forgotten as soon as you have mastered the myth. Interesting. Lewis, as I mentioned, is making this distinction between MacDonald as a storyteller and MacDonald as a writer, saying, in Lewis's opinion, I don't actually think he's really that great of a writer. He says none of his stuff is, he says he doesn't have a single book that's very good. but MacDonald as a storyteller is very different. And this is where, when we were thinking about some of the ways that we actually didn't get too much into this with Tolkien when he talked about the origins of fairy stories. But one of the things that's really tricky about myths or fairy stories or legends is that we often don't have one particular source of them. There's this great story about Jason and the Argonauts, in that we have a work of art that was discovered in some kind of archaeological dig that archaeologists and classicists are sure is Jason, and it's him like coming out of the mouth of a dragon. But in no stories about Jason do we ever have him being eaten by the dragon. In fact, part of what he does is slay these things, right? And so we're missing that particular story, right? The same way that often we might take someone like Homer, or let's even say Sophocles, when we think about Oedipus Rex or something, we actually are really just getting Sophocles' version of that myth, even though we might kind of on top of that think of it as that's the original, that's the version. You and I talked about this with Disney movies. When we think about fairy tales in the 21st century, if you ask someone to tell you the story of Cinderella, 9 times out of 10 they're going to tell you Disney's version of Cinderella. If you ask them to do the same thing with like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, all these things, that you're just going to hear that because that's the way it's been ingrained in our kind of cultural imagination. But that's not necessarily the only version of that story. And what Lewis is saying here is that the words don't really matter in that. It's just the series of events. And he says that's the genius of MacDonald. Do you mind if I read one more thing here?
Let's hear it.
He says, to call it literary genius seems unsatisfactory since it can coexist with great inferiority in the art of words. Nay, since its connection with words at all turns out to be merely external and, in a sense, accidental. Nor can it be fitted into any of the other arts. It begins to look as if there was an art or a gift which criticism has largely ignored. It may even be one of the greatest arts, for it produces works which give us as much delight and as much wisdom and strength as the works of the greatest poets. It is in some ways more akin to music than to poetry, or at least to most poetry. It goes beyond the expression of things we have already felt.
Wow.
He's saying that something about MacDonald's stories, not his words, but his stories, taps into something transcendent that the words are almost meaningless in a way.
Interesting.
That'll be a really interesting way for us to approach this, to see if we're feeling what Lewis is saying here.
Yeah.
Reading through this chapter, did you feel at all like this was a step down in quality?
I did not. And whenever we read a Lewis quote like this, I have to keep in mind that this is his full-time thing.
Okay.
He is very, very well read, and he probably has a lot of wonderful stuff to compare it to. I thought the writing in The Princess and the Goblin, I've only read the first 6 chapters at the time of this recording, but I thought it was really, really well done.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think the story beats are really good.
Yeah.
And just the information that's being conveyed. And part of the appeal might be that there's not overly done writing, that it's not this very stylistic or overdone prose.
Yeah, well, we'll see. I didn't necessarily, after I read that, I went back after reading this preface and I read through the first 3 chapters one final time before we recorded. And I could maybe start to see some of what Lewis is talking about. You and I, by the way, for new listeners, are by no means literary critics in the slightest way. So, as you mentioned, this is, Lewis is a tutor at Magdalen College in Oxford. This is what he does for a living. And so he might pick up on these things more than you and I would. I noticed that the sentences were more simple, but I thought that was more of a choice than it was a flaw. Right. But let's start talking about this actual story, because I said we don't want to do too much analyzation of it, and yet here we are doing a little bit of that. So let's actually jump into the story itself. We don't really have an odd chapter. We have 2 odd chapters and 1 even chapter, but why don't, just for old time's sake, we'll still continue to alternate our chapter summaries here.
Sounds good to me.
It's a little bit harder, though, because it's 3 chapters in 150 words still, but I guess they're shorter chapters.
They are shorter chapters.
All right.
And if you want, you can fit more in if you decrease the margins, like the publisher of my copy.
I bought you a new copy of it. All right.
know, it's not here yet.
The podcast bought you a new copy. Thank you to our patron supporters.
That's
right. Sorry that we ordered Phil 2 copies of Princess and the Goblin because I didn't pay attention to who was shipping it.
I'm not the one you're going to have to tell about the $2 you wasted.
Yeah, the $2.
That was someone's monthly gift.
Somebody's dancing lawn gift. We're really sorry. That's a $2 a month tier that you can give at. Somebody's dancing lawn gift went to Phil's book.
I'm going to take it out of your curse jar.
All right. Well, let me go ahead and share our summary for the first 3 chapters.
Before you do that, can I read the titles of each chapter?
Oh, please do. Yes, go ahead.
Chapter 1 is Why the Princess Has a Story About Her. It's everything you need to know right there.
There you go.
Chapter 2 is The Princess Loses Herself.
Chapter 3 is the best one.
And chapter 3 is The Princess and dash, we shall see who. A little bit of a cliffhanger.
Ooh, in my printing of the book, it's only 1 dash. So.
Oh, it's 2 dashes together.
Oh,
for
okay.
a super dash.
Oh, nice. Yeah. All right. Well, here is those 3 chapters. Once upon a time, there was a princess named Irene who lived in a beautiful kingdom. The mountains in this kingdom were full of treacherous goblins who had abandoned civilized society some years ago. One day, the 8-year-old princess became bored with her toys and decided to travel up a mysterious staircase connected to her rooms. After traveling up multiple flights of stairs, she came across long passages with many doors. Eventually, she made her way to a landing with 3 doors. Inside one of them, she found a mysterious woman spinning, who appeared both old and ageless. This old woman claimed to be Irene's great-great-grandmother, who came to the castle when Irene was just a baby. This grandmother, who was also named Irene, eats the eggs of pigeons who live at the top of the tower. After speaking for a while, the grandmother helps Irene return to her room.
That about sums it up.
That was... Nothing this weird ever happened in Narnia.
We're literally on a different playing field now. It's a whole new ball game.
We don't spend too much time talking about what we liked and disliked, but did you love these first 3 chapters as much as I did?
I really did.
I had so much fun with this, especially just how and I've read this book before, but it's been a few years, and I clearly had forgotten some things because I did not remember about this discussion that we'll get to in a moment about what eggs is she eating, and they're not chickens' eggs, they're pigeons' eggs, and all these, and it's kind of ridiculous, and I love it.
I was surprised at how much information was conveyed in the first 2 paragraphs.
Mm-hmm.
I was glad I went back and reread this because it had been a couple of months, and I forgot that she was living with her family, but then she was sent away, and that's a key detail.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But it's so many key details in so few sentences. Quite a bit of information is conveyed, and then you just get right into it. And we have characters meeting surprise characters, and there's all this exposition that comes with that.
And speaking of exposition, we can talk about this first chapter, which has no dialogue, no story, is really just telling us about Princess Irene and telling us about the goblin. So what does MacDonald tell us about Irene here at the beginning of the book?
She's very beautiful. She has blue eyes. There's an incredible description of the light in her eyes. It looks like stars lodge themselves in the blue of her eyes.
And it's really interesting because, again, maybe to push back a little bit on Lewis's critique here, I actually really loved the way that MacDonald transitioned between, she has these beautiful eyes like stars, and the ceiling of her nursery is also blue, but I doubt that she ever really saw the stars in the sky, and let me tell you why. And I thought it was a fun transition because then MacDonald goes into telling us about the mountains in this kingdom and how they're filled with gnomes or cobbles or goblins. Do you want to read a little bit about those subterranean caverns?
Sure. So right after that, there was a legend current in the country that at one time they lived above ground and were very like other people. But for some reason or other, concerning which there were different legendary theories, the king had laid what they thought too severe taxes upon them, or had required observances of them they did not like, or had begun to treat them with more severity in some way or other, and imposed stricter laws, and the consequence was that they had all disappeared from the face of the country. According to the legend, however, instead of going to some other country, they had all taken refuge in the subterranean caverns, whence they never came out but at night, and then seldom showed themselves in any numbers, and never to many people at once.
I love this description of the goblins because right here we get a sense that, okay, this is not a terrifying, frightening story. And we'll talk about this later when we actually meet the goblins. Tolkien actually based a lot of his goblins in The Hobbit off of this book.
That's interesting because this really started to feel familiar.
Doesn't it? But one of the things that's different about the orcs, which are not necessarily the same thing as goblins in Middle-earth, one of the things that's different about something like orcs is those are just actually terrifying, or like the Uruk-hai or something like that. Mm-hmm. Whereas the goblins here in this story, I mean, they don't even seem all that evil. One, you kind of like feel for them. They're like, they just didn't want to pay the taxes, man. I mean, like they seem like the good guys here.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, you were raised in America. We don't want to pay our taxes.
It's like it's like George Washington was one of them. He was like, we got to get out of here. We don't want to pay these unfair taxes, right? But then even later on, MacDonald, as he describes them, he even says they're not even evil necessarily. He says they have enough of affection left for each other, and that preserves them from being absolutely cruel for cruelty's sake. Instead, they kind of just like, he says, they cherish this ancestral grudge against those who occupied their former possession, and especially against the descendants of the king who have caused their expulsion. So he says, I mean, they're not nice, don't get me wrong. They're definitely not good guys. They're very clearly going to be the antagonists of the story, but they're not cruel for cruelty's sake. They're not Sauron level evil or, White Witch levels of evil here. They have a little bit more of a backstory, which I think is just interesting that we hear this about them. We do hear also that they're grotesque, they're ugly because they've lived underground for so long, and there's a little bit of a mystery about them. Not many people seem to know about them at all.
And even though they're misshapen in body, they've grown more intelligent and very, very clever, and they're able to do things that humans would not be able to do or even dream of.
I'm very excited for you to see the ways in which they differ from the men of this book. But just like we should mention, just like when we were reading through Narnia, I have read this book before. You have read the first 6 chapters, but have not read past that.
Not yet, but
you're probably going to go ahead.
Yeah.
But you're probably going to.
I'm not getting stuck in that traffic.
He's like, I've done this already. So right now, I have read the whole book, and you have not. But we are not going through with that any longer. Phil said, look, I did that for 7 seasons.
It was embarrassing.
In order for me to get you to come back to do the next season, you're like, look, I'm not allowed to read it. I'm not going to suffer again.
Yeah, for even more context, you have to understand that Daniel has more degrees than I do. And he also does more research and can synthesize more information more quickly. And so he'll say this really intelligent thing, which is this combination of multiple points from multiple things he's read. And then I'll say something like, well, the White Witch was, she was evil. you got to admit that.
Yeah, so we're both...
No more.
We're both going to have read the book throughout. So we will, as always, I should just, I guess, mention this as well, too. We will only talk about what we cover. So we're not going to talk about chapters 4, 5, or 6. We're going, and if something happens then that might make more sense to us now, though, we're going to still continue to talk about it as if people who are reading this maybe are reading it for the first time. Right. So we won't go ahead, even if you or I have more of the insider info from later on in the book.
Yes, no spoilers.
That's chapter 1, though. It's a pretty short chapter there. We get into chapter 2, which is also short as well. The princess loses herself, and this is where I mentioned that she just gets lost in her own house. Tell me about this. This is wild.
It turns out that house is a lot more complicated than it first appeared to her. We've all been there. She starts looking around, and then she gets lost, and she gets really freaked out.
Why does she decide to leave? I actually had to read this a second time. One, because I wasn't quite sure why she decided to leave. And then 2, I was honestly confused about where exactly this flight of stairs like resided. Were you confused about this, or was this just me?
Well, I am now. I was clear on why she went wandering around.
Just boredom, right?
She was bored. She has this massive table of toys.
We got to talk about this, actually.
And the description is pretty incredible. He really shoots his illustrator in the foot.
I know.
He basically says, if someone's going to illustrate this, good luck.
Why don't you're the illustrator. Why don't you go ahead and read it? It's great. Just where if the artist would like to draw, it's so funny.
It was a picture, though, worth seeing. The princess sitting in the nursery with the sky ceiling over her head, at a great table covered with her toys. If the artist would like to draw this, I should advise him not to meddle with the toys. I am afraid of attempting to describe them, and I think he had better not try to draw them. He had better not. He can do 1,000 things I can't, but I don't think he could draw those toys. No man could better make the princess herself than he could, though, leaning with her back bowed into the back of the chair, her head hanging down, and her hands in her lap. Very miserable, as she would say herself, not even knowing what she would like, except it were to go out and get thoroughly wet and catch a particularly nice cold and have to go to bed and take gruel. The next moment after you see her sitting there, her nurse goes out of the room.
I thought this was hilarious.
So for people who are just joining us, I have a degree in illustration they called it something else. They called it communication arts, but I went to school for drawing.
Is it just to satiate your grandparents when they ask, what are you doing?
No, it made it way more confusing.
Also, you're like, I'm doing communication arts. Like, oh, that's not a waste. That's fine.
Yeah, maybe in theory. It was also hard to explain what classes I took. They were trying to understand. They would say, well, what are your classes called? Because maybe we can connect there.
Yeah,
and I would say surface, time,
really?
Space.
Those
were 3 of my classes. I had those 3 in drawing. And we both went to VCU and they renamed everything. So English class was focused inquiry.
Oh my goodness.
You know what every class is? A focused inquiry.
Yeah, it was those classes were weird, man.
Swing and a miss.
Well, I thought this reminded me of Tolkien in the very first chapter of The Hobbit. Tolkien, if you think about the difference between his prose and his approach to narration in The Hobbit and then in The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien in The Hobbit is much more familiar with his readers. And in fact, he makes a couple of asides to them. And there's even parts of it that are relatively humorous, in which case something that he never really does in The Lord of the Rings. He's a much more removed narrator in The Lord of the Rings. And Lewis does this a little bit. He's kind of somewhere in the middle of those two, I think, but they're both Tolkien. Those two versions of Tolkien in Narnia. But this right here is something that was just, a complete kind of like fourth wall break. I know they didn't call it that in the 19th century, but...
Because they didn't have walls?
Yeah. Oh, they didn't at all. They didn't exist. But I thought this was really funny. The sentence that really... I laughed out loud when he just had a sentence because... All right, the last sentence you read, or maybe the second to last sentence you read, is about 5 or 6 lines long. No man could better make the princess herself, and he goes on to describe her. But a sentence or two before that is a very short sentence that just says, he had better not.
Yeah.
And it seems like he's threatening the illustrator.
Right.
I love it.
It's so good.
I think what is actually, going back to the story here, what confuses me a little bit is the fact that she, right after this, her nurse leaves, and she decides to... go up and leave her chair and go out, not out of the room that the nurse went out of, but to a different room and just climb up the stairs. And I guess what confuses me here is, has she just always had a door in her room that leads she knows not where, and she was okay with that? Because I'll tell you one thing, in the house that we lived in growing up, from about 4 years old to, 6th or 7th grade, I can't remember when we moved, but I was in the bedroom that had the attic. Mm-hmm. And there was a good year where that felt like a punishment.
Oh, wow.
So I had my closet, you could open it up, and then you could open a door inside the closet that was in into the stairs. And I don't know, maybe I was about 6 or 7 years old.
This is incredibly hard to picture.
Nah.
You had a door in your closet?
I had a door. Is that not a normal thing?
No, it's not a normal thing.
Okay, so the bedroom that I had, if you were to open the closet, I had a very small walk-in closet, but it was a little bit of a walk-in closet. And inside that walk-in closet was another door that led to the attic. Is that not normal?
It's even more wild the second time. And when we did the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and we didn't really understand what Turkish Delight tasted like, we had people offering to send us Turkish Delight from all over the world.
Doors now?
Now people are going to tell us about where their basement entrance or their attic entrance was.
What about you? When you had an attic, I assume growing up, how did you get there?
We had a bonus room which was above the garage.
Okay.
And the front part of that, the part that would face out into the street, had this very small area that was technically our attic-like space.
Oh,
And
but
that
it
was
wasn't.
where
You
all
didn't go
the-
up at all.
You didn't go up. You actually kind of went down a step. That's
Ooh.
where all the Christmas decorations were. And it was covered with that pink stuff, which I now know is called insulation. But there was
You're like, after you ate it, they took you to the hospital.
I thought it was cotton candy.
You're like, there's cotton candy in the attic. It's awesome.
I didn't think it was cotton candy. I got it mixed up with asbestos. I thought that we had lined our business.
We have asbestos all in our house.
A little
We
bit.
get
My
out.
dad had told me, don't let it touch you because you would get these fiberglass splinters.
I remember that. Yeah.
And so I was very careful not to touch it, but I touched it one time and I just freaked out. I was asbestos.
Well, maybe that'll be the fun thing for this season. Tell us, where was the attic in your house growing up? What's ironic is that you and I have these stories of our attics when we were children. You and I both have terrible attics now because we live in row houses in the city,
Yes.
in very old homes. My home was built over 100 years ago. I think yours was too.
Yep, almost.
And
99 years.
So the way to get into my attic right now, which our attic is 3 feet tall, like you cannot stand up inside of it, and there is no pull down ladder. Is in my daughter's room. There just is a square tile that you move, and you have to get a ladder to get up there. The only thing that's in there is the return for our HVAC for the upstairs of our house, because it's miserable to go up
In
there.
case you want to send it to the manufacturer.
Exactly, yeah. In case we just want to get it back to them. Do you guys have an attic in yours? Do you and Sarah have an attic?
We do. It was added much later than 99 years ago.
Not in the closet.
Not in the closet.
Is that really a weird thing? Huh?
Yeah, I feel like maybe there was the space for it, but it wasn't sealed off enough to be used. I'm not sure. But I think that this was in the past 15, 20 years they added this. But they also, whoever did it didn't do the best job because it looks like it's about to fall through the...
Oh, that's terrifying.
roof.
Yeah. Do you feel like we're giving too much information? Are we doxing ourselves by telling where our attics are in our houses?
If you can do something with that, and that gets you closer than having our zip code on the PO box at the end of this episode, then come visit us.
Now I know which one it is because I can tell where their attics are in their houses. All right, so I would, just to get back to my story as a kid, it frightened me a little bit to have this. I think it wasn't the monsters in the closet for me. It was like those monsters had a lot further they could go. Like they had a lot more space. I literally had a giant closet if you counted the attic as part of it. Mm-hmm. But I definitely had been up there before. Are we to make from this that Irene has never walked up there before?
It sounds like she's always been entertained, and she's always had a staff around her to entertain her or cook for her or do all these things.
She's maybe wanted to do this, and she's like, "Oh, she left. Let's go."
Yeah.
All right.
She was bored, and she waited for the right opportunity, and then she investigated. Now, keep in mind, I have only read the first 6 chapters. I don't actually know what happens, but I'm a little suspicious of the fact that he says the princess wakes up a little and looks about her. And then something dreamlike happens. It's just a little suspicious. That's all I'm saying.
Interesting thing here, too, just to get back to some of McDonald and his words, is the fact that he kind of changes tenses here. Because when he says this, when he says, she says, that last sentence, says, the next moment after you see her sitting there, her nurse goes out of the room. And then he goes on, and like you said, the princess wakes up a little and looks about her. Within a paragraph, it's up and up, she ran. So then we get to past tense. So it's just interesting that the tenses feel like they're shifting. And then for the rest of the chapter, he stays completely in just kind of a very normal past tense, like you would read a lot of modern kind of books.
Yes. Also, I'm really curious about some of the grammatical choices here. George MacDonald is Scottish, is that
correct?
That's right. Part of this could be Scottish English. Part of this could be that it is written a long time ago. But, for example, these 2 sentences. So she thought, but she had lost herself long ago. It doesn't follow that she was lost because she had lost herself, though.
That doesn't make perfect sense to you?
No.
I wonder if some of that is both a geographical thing as well as in going back in time. We have some of our 6th graders are reading Kidnapped this year, which I've been really excited about. Kidnapped, obviously, by Stevenson, and Stevenson as well is Scottish. And as I was looking through that novel recently, there's a lot of stuff that, and that novel is definitely written for an older age. I don't even think it's considered like a children's novel or anything. I think it's just like an adventure novel. But there's there's like kind of like almost, I guess, what you could maybe call Scottish slang. I mean, you wouldn't really call it this, but you get the point, that he uses a lot, and you have to look up a lot of words that I was like, I have no idea what that is. And then just some of the ways that his sentences and phrases were done was also a little bit different too. So I wonder if it's both and again, that's published in right actually around the same time, because that's 1880 something. And so I wonder if it's both the time it's written, but also maybe some of the geographical context as well too, because Kidnap's written around the same time in 1880 something, and obviously Princess and Goblin is 1872. So I wonder if it's a little bit of both. It does stand out to me, but I think the more we talked about this last season on the reading of old books, the more you read older novels, not that are translated, but they're still new enough that you're reading them the original way they were written. I think you do sometimes come across things like that. That maybe a little bit's maybe just lost in, not translation, but just lost in the way that the language has changed in the last 150 years.
Right. Yeah.
This chapter pretty much ends, though, after she goes up the steps and she runs around going through different passages, seeing a bunch of doors, and she gets lost and she begins to cry before continuing to go up a final flight of stairs.
She does it in a very odd way. It was so steep that she goes up like a four-legged
just like the Gollum move, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
This is where Tolkien got the idea of Gollum from. He'd never thought of a person walking on all fours. It was right here that well, let's go to chapter 3, because chapter 3 is significantly longer than the first two chapters, and this is where things get wild. Tell me a little bit about this.
She basically runs into this super old lady that she didn't know was living in her house.
This is every kid's nightmare, right?
Yes.
It's
also the plot of a recent Academy Award winning film.
Wait,
I'm not going to say which one because it's a big spoiler, but we're still talking about this kind of stuff. People living in your house.
I don't know what this is. Oh yeah, that is true. Yeah. I saw that movie in theaters. Fantastic.
I did too.
I
took a friend who did not understand what he was getting into. It was very quiet on the ride.
I don't think I knew what I was getting into.
Yeah, it was so unexpected. So if you don't understand what we're talking about, just watch the past 15 years of Academy Award winning films.
And eventually one of them will have someone living in another person's house. So yeah, she gets in there. She finds this very old lady who is spinning, right? Not on like a Peloton. So we do need to make that clear.
That would be a really great update.
that's the new,
because she doesn't look very much like an old lady, and it's probably because she
works out all the time.
Hours and hours of cardio.
When Netflix gets the rights to this, they're definitely going to like update it and be like, she's going to be on a Peloton.
She's in a spinning class.
It's great. We get the ad revenue and everything, and so she meets.
I'm willing to bet a significant amount of money that at some point you will have an exercise bike.
I
think you're going to move to the suburbs, and that'll be one of the first things you buy.
I would treadmill first. My wife is a big runner, and so I think that's what she would really appreciate, is not having to go to the gym when it's really hot or when it's really like it's raining or something.
You slipped
like
into
that.
your Scottish accent.
Yeah, that's
not having to go to gym.
I've been reading this so much these last few days. But okay, but back to this chapter. She comes across this woman. She's a little confused. She doesn't really know what's going on, and the woman welcomes her in, and this is great because this will be a theme that comes up quite a bit throughout the book. I just want to mention it here, but I think maybe we'll wait for some later chapters to actually talk about it. But she says, "Come in, my dear, come in. I'm glad to see you." Here's what MacDonald says next. That the princess was a real princess you might see now quite plainly, for she didn't hang on to the handle of the door and stare without moving, as I have known some do who ought to have been princesses, but who were only rather vulgar little girls. She did as she was told, stepped inside the door at once, and shut it gently behind her. This is a big focus for MacDonald, in that there's a certain way that a noble girl should behave and act. And I actually wanted to bring up another quote from a preface to the book that I bought, but not the one that's yours, which is
You got a preface too.
which is by Ursula Le Guin. I believe that's how you pronounce her name. I've never actually said it out loud.
Ursula K. Le Guin.
This one, it just says Ursula Le Guin. No K is here, but I know that for a lot of her other stuff, like the Earthsea books, she's published under that name. But she wrote a short preface to this version I have by Puffin Classics, and I wanted to just read one little part of a paragraph that talks about this theme, which will come up throughout the rest of the story. MacDonald is also stern and clear about what nobility is. It has nothing to do with money or social status. A princess is a girl who behaves nobly. A girl who behaves nobly is a princess. Curdie, the miner, being brave and kind and behaving nobly and wisely, is a prince. The king is a king because he's a good man. No other definition is allowed. This is radically moral democracy. It's very different from the lazy-minded stories that call some characters good and others bad, although they all behave exactly the same way. The goods win the battles and the bads lose, besides being ugly. MacDonald's goblins are only ugly because they behave badly. Well, she tells a little bit more here, but that idea right there is definitely one that Lewis and Tolkien pick up and run with as well, too.
Yes.
This idea of good... one of the reasons that you and I were... Well, you were a little bit hotter on it than I was, but one of the reasons I was not super hot on Rings of Power was its depiction of some of the quote-unquote bad guys as being more, sympathetic. Yeah. And the way that Tolkien...
And being more complex than black and white.
And the way that Tolkien has the bad guys in the Legendarium is that, no, they're just evil. Like, evil just actually does exist. It does exist, and some things are just evil. And Lewis is the same thing. And in a lot of the kind of modern storytelling in a postmodern landscape, we're often trying to tell stories that always... I mean, how many of them... We get what was the Emma Stone movie that came out just a few years ago? Cruella. Remember this? They're like, we got to tell a bad... Did you not know this movie came out? You're making a face like you didn't know this movie came out.
I thought you were going to say something very different.
The movie... They did like a prequel to 101 Dalmatians that's like she was like a tortured soul. Mm-hmm. Whereas like that character is so great in the movie from the 60s because she just wants to kill the puppies to make a coat. And like that's great. That's a great bad guy. We have a story about 101 Dalmatians to have your bad guy just be this evil, narcissistic woman who is so obsessed with material possessions that she doesn't mind killing 101 Dalmatians to make this coat. And then we tell this story like, well, she really was like bullied when she was younger. And it's like, that's not the point, And so Tolkien and Lewis very much have in their stories a similar kind of thing. The good guys do good things. The bad guys do bad things. And I think often modern readers, and you and I are part of this too, have a tendency to think, oh, that's much too simple. We need everything to be complex and dark and gritty, and we have to have anti-heroes, and none of our characters can just be like Aragorn, at the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, who just accepts that he's the king and just rolls with it, right? Even we love the movies, but one of the things the movies do is they make him very reluctant to be king, as opposed to the books where he's not reluctant at all. He's like, yeah, I'm king. Let's go. Yeah. And we always want to make things more complex a lot of times in modern storytelling.
I feel like the first few times that happened, do you remember the children's book where it was the big bad wolf, but from the perspective of the wolf?
Yeah.
I remember thinking that was the most creative thing I'd ever seen. Now, I was in elementary school. It may have been the most creative thing that I had ever seen at the time. And I feel like that kind of idea permeated our culture and our stories. We were always finding out the story of the bad guy and kind of understanding him. Even as recent as The Dark Knight Rises, where Bane is just an evil character, and you even get a little bit of his backstory, and you kind of understand some of where he may be coming from.
You're like, oh, he makes sense. He's got good things to say, right. That kind of thing.
But then we had some more stories come out after that were, no, it's just, these are bad guys, and it's very clear, and there's not as much of a backstory. And that was refreshing too. It was nice to have good and evil back.
Well, and that's one of the, just in that same trilogy of films, one of the reasons why Joker is such a great bad guy, and I'm not talking about the new movie. I don't know if you even saw it.
I did.
The one with Joaquin Phoenix.
Yeah.
Did not like it at all.
Yeah. There were some really impressive things about it, but I did not enjoy it.
Well, the whole idea is that this is supposed to be a character, and again, you and I are also comic book nerds as well too, and I think this character works really well. One of the things I love about The Dark Knight as a movie is the fact that when he gives those two different stories about how he got the scars, he changed it, and it doesn't matter. Yeah. He's just a psychopath. He just is a bad guy. And that's what makes him interesting. We don't need... I mean, there's times when we can have other stories like this, but I think one of the reasons that we find fairy stories like The Princess and the Goblin so warm and so welcoming is because there's good and there's bad, and we know what those things are. And I think so often, as Tolkien mentioned in his essay on fairy stories, we relegate these things to the nursery because, but the world is so much more complex and it's so much more gray and things are difficult. So anything that just has a good and a bad, that must just be for children, right? Because real adult stories have morally complex characters. And that's not to say that the world isn't morally complex. There are things that are, difficult. One of my favorite things to do as a teacher is have Socratic seminars where we bring up questions that are not easy to answer and require us to really think through, philosophical problems or ethical dilemmas. But there also are things that are good and bad, especially for us as Christians reading novels like this, and McDonald's a Christian, and Tolkien and Lewis are Christians as well too, is there really is good, there really is bad, there really is right, there really is wrong. And I think when we try to make every single story have this kind of, this gray kind of area that it exists in, we start to actually lose sight of what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad. We've now questioned those things. Whereas we have here, the princess does these things because she's a princess, and therefore she acts like a princess.
Right. It's interesting hearing phrases like this, and it was really interesting to hear Ursula Le Guin's take on it, because Ursula Le Guin's fiction is so progressive
very much so.
Ideas. I did not expect for her to be as supportive of this, but it just speaks to how complex real people are too.
Yeah, this is true.
It also dovetails interestingly with something that happened in 1872. There are two kind of main events that stand out. Okay. One is that Grant was elected, and I'm not sure if he was reelected. I'm not sure if he was president before that, but he defeated someone, and
he was reelected.
He was reelected in 1872.
Horace Greeley.
I
did not know at the top of my head. That is Wikipedia. You're like, wow, that's really great. You made a face like you were really impressed with my knowledge of the 1872 election. But McDonald's he's not American.
He's not American, but there's something that happens in America that is interesting when you're talking about how girls should be princesses. And it's that Susan B. Anthony votes for the first time.
Oh, interesting.
But it's illegal, and she is fined an absurd amount for the time, $1,000. She never paid it. But it's just it's an interesting point in history because there's a lot of social change happening, a lot of legal change happening in the States. But some of the things that happen in the States are also happening in other places.
Yeah, women's suffrage is happening all over the Western world at this point.
And the same year that slavery was declared illegal in the United States, the same year that the serfs were freed in Russia. And in a similar way, it wasn't a immediate change. It was a gradual thing that happened over time, and then even with it fully taking place over a couple years as the news spread and it was enacted and stuff, things don't instantly improve for the groups that were being oppressed in those situations. So there's a lot of change happening around the world, and it's, I think, important to have that kind of context, especially when you're reading a story, to understand this is what the world was like, because we're at risk of chronological snobbery, which is a term that Lewis introduced us to.
Yeah.
When viewing this from a very recent, modern societal view of things.
That's really interesting. That's a good point. Let's move on to more of this conversation so we can go ahead and end this chapter, because it's here that things get pretty wild. We don't have to go through every little bit of dialogue here, but
it's mostly dialogue.
Because it is. This too interesting from a prose perspective here. Once the conversation gets going, it literally just becomes line after line back and forth. We don't even have much of like said Irene or said the grandmother. It just is them talking back and forth.
It's just two people, lines of dialogue all the way down the page, and short dialogue too.
Yeah, very short, very choppy. I would assume McDonald is definitely doing this on purpose. she asks her why she's been crying. She says, well, I got lost and stuff. And then they go on, and eventually Irene finds out that the older woman has the name Irene as well too. And she's like, oh, that's kind of crazy. And she's like, that's not that crazy. I told your dad to name you after me, you know.
His name is Forrest too.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't mention where she was from. Sorry. Yeah. She's from the South.
South Scotland.
Yeah.
South.
So this goes on, and she finds out that this woman is her great-great-grandmother. And she's like, oh, did you just get here? And she's like, no, I've been here since you arrived, which we learned in the first chapter is somewhat around right after she was born. It's implied, but not told explicitly at this point, that her mother died probably shortly after childbirth here. And her dad, kind of in a very traditional 19th century way, was like, all right, Mom has passed away, so off you go.
Yeah.
You know, I've got
to send you to Tatooine. You'll be raised by your
by your aunt and your uncle there.
Yeah, your uncle.
And so she goes on, and what I love is that, and Irene really does come across as an 8-year-old here, which I really love the way that she feels her age, because she asks, you know, not questions like, wait, why have you been here forever and no one knows? She's like, where do you sleep?
Yeah.
Like, I love this.
And what do you eat? And are you 50? Are you more than 100?
Yeah. Where do you sleep? What do you eat? Where's your crown? If you were my great-grandmother, aren't you a queen?
Yeah, I would very much like to see the crown.
All of these. I love the way that this conversation goes. And McDonald gives us a lot of answers. This question of, where do you eat? Well, they go out. The landing she is on has 3 doors. When you arrive there on the steps, there's 2 doors across from each other and 1 door across from the stairs. The door across from the stairs, we learn, actually leads out to a tower where there are a bunch of pigeons in their nest, and great-grandmother Irene just eats the eggs. That's what she lives off of. And then in the other 2 rooms, one is her bedroom, which we do not see, and the other room is the room that she's spinning in. And we're told that these rooms, or at least the room that we see, is very sparse. There's no carpet. There's no rug. There's not much furniture. Princess Irene even makes a comment of like, this isn't that great of a room,
Yeah.
We live in a castle, right? It should be other nice places. But they go out there, and Princess Irene sees the pigeons. But after they talk for a while, she realizes, I really probably need to get back. In fact, her grandmother reminds her, you do need to get back, because your nurse is going to be really worried about where you are. And that's kind of how the chapter ends. What else do you want to add to that?
Smash cut to credits. I love the amount of details. It makes it feel real somehow, even though it's a little odd that she has this whole staircase and set of rooms that she didn't know about, even though she's lived there for a while. But she is 8. That kind of helped. The amount of details about what she eats and where she sleeps just kind of grounds it in reality a little bit more. And there are all these little details that if you have read enough stories or seen enough movies, you have a hint that there's something that we don't know yet, and it propels the reader forward and makes you want to find out what it is. But there are lots of the great-grandmother Irene having curious smiles when she answers questions.
Yes.
Or she answers it in a certain way that you understand. As a slightly older than 8 years old reader, you understand, oh, she's hinting at something, or she's dodging the question, but appearing to answer it. It also has a very interesting last sentence.
Yeah, why don't we read that whole last paragraph where it begins with the little princess? Do you want to read that?
Sure. The little princess put her hand in the old lady's, who, looking this way and that, brought her to the top of the first stair, and thence to the bottom of the second, and did not leave her till she saw her halfway down the third. When she heard the cry of her nurse's pleasure at finding her, she turned and walked up the stairs again, very fast indeed for such a very great grandmother, and sat down to her spinning with another strange smile on her sweet old face. About the spinning of hers, I will tell you more another time. Guess what she was spinning.
And that's the end of the chapter. That's really interesting. I love this. I thought the 3rd chapter here was just a blast. I had so much fun with this. And it's silly in a way that we didn't really get that kind of silliness in Narnia.
Yeah, it felt more serious, more focused.
And I don't mean that pejoratively, though. Oh, it's so silly and juvenile. No, it feels there's like a sense of it's jovial, I guess you might say.
It's jovial, but also in control. It's
Yes.
not just messing with the reader. I feel like it is hinting at the adventure
To come.
that lays ahead.
Well, in the next episode, Phil, we've got chapters 4, 5, and 6. Chapter 4 is What the Nurse Thought of It. Chapter 5, The Princess Lets Well Enough Alone. And chapter 6 is The Little Miner.
Miner.
Yes, correct. The Little Miner. And I'm really excited because in this, I'll just give a quick one sentence here summary. But Ludi, the character we have barely met at this point, and Irene are going to venture treacherously into the mountains. So we might know where this is going to go, knowing what we already know about the mountains. But Irene's actually going to go into the mountains in the next 3 chapters. In fact, that's the name of our next episode, The Mountains.
Ooh.
Phil, we've already done a lot in this episode, especially because we were introducing things. So what do you say we skip listener feedback for this particular episode and then bring it back next episode for chapters 4, 5, and 6?
Sounds great to me. And we'll have a thing at the end about how you can leave that feedback. You can email us. You can visit our website and then email us. You can also call our phone number, leave us a voicemail.
That's exactly right. Why don't you go ahead and finish it for us?
This episode is made possible by our patrons over at patreon.com. If you'd like to support the show, you can listen to a bonus episode each month along with other rewards. Special thanks goes to John Marr, Emily Wakefield, Ryan Smith, Andrew Trophy, and Becca Brown for supporting us at our top tiers. Thanks to them, we don't have to have annoying sponsors in the middle of an episode.
Oh, I didn't tell you that we already, at this point, they've all heard 5 because now we're doing that.
You know what we should offer? We should wear branded logo t-shirts if you sponsor the show.
What do you mean? Oh, yeah, but like no one would see it because there's no... You don't want to turn this into a video podcast?
I don't want to turn it into a video podcast.
We wouldn't be able to
I do
sit
want
on
to wear
couches like this.
Lots of logos everywhere.
But we still could do the logos.
You can email us at hello@lampostlistener.com or leave us a voicemail at 406-646-6733. Previous episodes, links, and book information can be found at our website lampostlistener.com. And
you know what I'll do? I'll even post a link to the copy of the book that we're reading for Princess and the Goblin.
Which one?
No, not the one you're reading. I'll put it in the episode's description, and I'll put it even on the website where we have all the other books we've mentioned.
That would be very helpful.
Yeah.
And are you going to post the standard ebooks one too?
I should, yeah. I'll do the link to the standard ebooks one as well too.
That would be great. A review on Apple Podcasts will help other listeners find the show and join our read-through. It will also dilute the effect of some pranksters who have left a 1-star review because they disagreed with something we said 6 years ago.
I don't think we have one of those, which we have more than enough reviews. I mean, still, if you haven't done it, we still would always love a review that's great, but we have more than enough to help with a 1-star. They mentioned the Enneagram. Ironically, I mentioned how much I dislike the idea of the Enneagram, and we still got a 1-star review because someone said they mentioned the Enneagram.
I would ask for a 4-star review. We both struggle with pride. And if you're not going
to leave a 5-star review, you can sit this one out, okay? My favorite you see this everywhere, like any kind of review. I love you go on Amazon, 3 stars, works great. Like, what does that mean?
What's the problem? My favorite is take something. I'm reading The Brothers Karamazov right now. Okay. Great book. 1 star. My copy was torn up when I got it. There are some people that I understand, like they think it's okay and they don't understand that they are reviewing the content, not the actual thing they received. It's confusing.
Is that clear though that it's the content?
What I don't understand is why that review is still allowed to exist. It's 9 years later and someone's like, mine had a cockroach on it.
Yeah. Like the mailman delivered it and it was wet.
Yeah.
2 stars.
Like, well, we are trying to ship things in paper bags now instead of plastic.
I used to, back in the day when I was on social media, this is probably more than 10 years ago at this point, when I had a Twitter account, and one of my favorite accounts was just like bad Amazon reviews, stuff like that. I just thought was the funniest thing.
There's a really successful book that is people leaving reviews of national parks, and they collected them in a book, and people were talking about how, like, not that great, no rides. It's Yellowstone.
Like, yeah.
Has a weird smell.
That smells bad here.
Smells like eggs.
Have you been to Yellowstone?
I have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It really does smell like eggs.
I don't own a ranch out there, but I've...
No, it's in Montana, which only tiny bits in Yellowstone, so. All right, keep going.
The last bullet point for these notes is thank you for coming along on this journey, and we will be back soon with another professionally done episode.
For chapters 4
Listener.
through 6
4 through
of
6.
The Princess and the Goblin.
You know, we should pull a George Lucas and do 4 through 6, and then 1 through 3, and then
Let's
7
not
through
do
9.
that. All right, we'll see everybody next time.
See you soon.